The entire history of Russian civilization is a continuous series of aggressive wars. The Muscovite Principality, the Tsarist and Soviet Empires, no matter which regime existed in Russia, it's constantly sought to expand its territories. There was no neighboring territory that Russians didn't show aggression towards, and not only towards their neighbors. Remember the history when Nicholas I sent troops to suppress the revolution in Belgium. Where is Russia and where is Belgium? One of the most common myths among Russians is the myth of the invincibility of their army. Propaganda steals the idea that Russia is the most powerful country in the world and has never lost a single war. Is that really the case? Today we're debunking myths and we'll talk about wars that Russia lost. Russia's lost wars. Let's go.
Watch this.
For over 300 years, Russia waged war against Sweden 10 times. The main reason for these conflicts was the control over the Baltic Sea and territories in the Baltic region. The first war occurred in the late 16th century, and the final conflict took place in the early 19th century, ending with Russia's annexation of Finland. However, not all wars with Sweden were successful for Russia. For instance, in the War of 1610–1617, Russia suffered defeat. Many cities, fortresses, and the entire Neva River were ceded to Sweden. For 100 years, Russia was cut off from Baltic Sea, which effectively became an inland sea of Sweden. Russia also abandoned its claims on Karelia and Livonia, that's the names of present-day Latvia and Estonia back then. King Gustavus Adolphus, speaking in the parliament about the significant victory in the country's history, prophetically said, "Russia is a dangerous neighbor." Additionally, Moscow paid a contribution to Sweden, 20,000 rubles, a significant sum in the early 17th century. It was almost a ton of silver at the time. The assertion that Russia never paid contributions and only had to give tributes to the Mongols after the Golden Horde era is another popular myth that Russians like to boast about. Russia indeed paid, and quite substantially. For more than 200 years, Russians paid tribute to the Crimean Khanate. Starting from the late 15th century, they sent money, furs, and other gifts to the Khan's palace. An attempt by Moscow to economize led to growing discontent in Crimea and culminated in the Crimean Whirlwind of 1521 when a Tatar army entered Moscow. The princely government sought peace, and Moscow Prince Vasily III confirmed his dependence on the Crimean Khan and promised no more delays in tribute payments. By the way, this was yet another war that Russia lost. After the end of the time of troubles, the practice of such payments was enshrined in a treaty. For many years, Russia sought the opportunity to officially annul tribute payments and was only able to do so definitely as a result of the campaigns of the Peter I.
Watch this.
Another neighbor that has repeatedly experienced Russia's sincere friendship is Poland. The series of Russo-Polish wars was driven by a complex of political, territorial, and religious reasons. Both countries claimed territories in modern-day Ukraine and Belarus and fought over them during the 16th and 17th century. These conflicts were often exacerbated by religious disagreements between the Catholic and Orthodox populations of the states. Furthermore, considering the elective monarchy in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, Russia always sought to influence the choice of kings and intervene in their selection. In the 18th century, the once powerful Polish state lost its political significance and became a battleground for foreign powers. During this time, Russia annexed a significant portion of Poland through a series of partitions. However, there were times when Poland emerged victorious in wars against Russia, though the Russians may not like to recall this. At the beginning of the 17th century, during Boris Godunov's rule, who succeeded the Rurik dynasty, the government was extremely unpopular. The country faced turmoil and uprisings, marking a period known as the Time of Troubles. Poland, a neighboring country, took advantage of the situation. King Sigismund III supported a pretender who claimed to be the son of Ivan the Terrible. The pretender was married to a Polish noblewoman, Marina Mnitzesz, and he was declared the legitimate heir. As a result of this Polish intervention, the pretender Dmitry I became the Russian Tsar, and for about a year, Poles essentially ruled Moscow. However, what is less known is that a significant portion of the army that defeated Russians and assisted the pretender in seizing the Russian throne consisted of Zaporozhian Cossacks. After Dmitry's uprising was quelled, Poles who lived in Moscow were killed, and the war continued in Russia. Another pretender emerged, and the Polish-Lithuanian army continued to capture city after city. After the Battle of Klushino, the Russian army ceased to exist, and the country experienced a collapse of statehood. A significant part of the country was occupied. Chaos and devastation reigned everywhere. A government composed of boyars chose Prince Vladislav, a Polish royal, as the Tsar, despite his refusal to convert to Orthodoxy. However, this did not result in the Polish dynasty ruling the remnants of the Russian state. For 2 years, Moscow was occupied by Poles and Lithuanians. Then the Russian militia expelled the Polish-Lithuanian army, and the new Tsar, Mikhail Romanov, was chosen at the Zemsky Sobor. A few years later, in 1617, Sigismund decided to try once again to capture Moscow. Initially, events were favorable for Russians. However, Zaporozhian Cossacks entered the war. Under the leadership of Hetman Petro Sahaydachny, they quickly advanced towards Moscow and joined forces with Poles. Unable to drive out the Poles and Cossacks and finding themselves in a difficult situation, Russian government concluded a disadvantageous truce. Poles gained the Smolensk and Chernigov regions.
Watch this!
After 300 years, Russians suffered a devastating defeat at the hands of Poles once again. As a result of the collapse of Russian Empire, Poland regained its independence. The Soviet government could not accept the loss of territories and prepared for revenge. The initial goal of the Bolsheviks was to regain control over all the former western provinces of the empire, including Poland and Ukraine. However, they soon began to view Poland as a barrier between the Soviets and Germany. Fomenting revolution in Germany and beyond was a cherished dream of Lenin and his circle. In the Polish state, there were also revanchist sentiments. The main goal of the leadership under Józef Pilsudski was the restoration of Poland within the borders of 1772. It's worth remembering that this was the year of the first of 3 partitions that eventually led to the loss of Polish statehood. In other words, Poland aimed to control the territories of Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. Furthermore, Pilsudski's strategic goal was to push Russia's borders as far away as possible from historical Polish territories. Poles never forgot the numerous hardships brought upon them by their aggressive northern neighbor throughout history. Following the end of the World War I, both the RSFSR and Poland began seizing Ukrainian, Belarusian, and Lithuanian territories left by German and Austrian forces. The Soviets advanced in Ukraine while Polish forces moved into Belarus and Lithuania. The meeting of these forces resulted in the formation of the Polish-Soviet Front, and battles began in January 1919. Ukrainian People's Republic fought alongside Poland. The first stage was successful for them. The combined Polish-Ukrainian forces captured Zhytomyr, Vinnytsia, Kiev, and other cities. However, the situation changed in favor of the Red Army. They redirected their most combat-ready units to the front and initiated a counter-offensive. Soon, the Red Army recaptured all of Ukraine, Belarus, and entered Polish territory. Under the leadership of Tukhachevsky, the Red Army rapidly advanced and soon found itself on the outskirts of Warsaw. Bolsheviks refused negotiations, hoping for a global revolution that was expected to happen in any moment. However, Bolsheviks overestimated their capabilities. They aimed to seize Warsaw on the run, but suffered a crushing defeat at its walls. The battle, known as a miracle on the Vistula, halted Bolsheviks' forces eager to spread into Europe. Tukhachevsky's army was defeated and retreated. Soviet Russia was forced to negotiate. According to the Riga Peace Treaty, extensive territories with a predominantly non-Polish population, Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and parts of other Russian provinces, were ceded to the Polish Republic. Additionally, Soviets agreed to return war trophies, all cultural and scientific valuables taken from Polish territory since 1772. In Polish self-perception, the victory in this war has never been doubted. It's commonly accepted that Poland saved Europe from a clash of civilizations. Soviet and now Russian historians and society naturally view it differently. Russian historians consider the 1919-1920 military actions as merely the first phase of the Soviet-Polish confrontation. The conflict was ultimately resolved in favor of the Soviet side in autumn 1939. However, one thing is certain: Poland's victory over Russia in 1920 put an end to the Bolsheviks' plans to export revolution to Central and Western Europe. Therefore, the Battle of Warsaw is often compared to Jan Sobieski's victory over the Turks near Vienna in 1683, as both stopped the expansion of empires.
Watch this.
Russia still dislikes remembering this war. The defeat is blamed on the betrayal by European countries, the fifth column, while persistently ignoring the main reasons: the country's backwardness and the degradation of its political system. The Crimean War of 1853-1856 revealed a complete failure of the Nicholas system, built on suppressing dissent, oppressing peoples, and repressions. In the mid-19th century, the Ottoman Empire was in a state of decline and internal decay. This led Russian Emperor Nicholas I to consider the idea of separating its Balkan possessions, where Orthodox people lived. He proposed to the British cabinet to divide Turkey, similar to how this grandmother had divided Poland and Austria and Prussia. The Emperor of Russia was puzzled why his idea did not find understanding. The times had changed. Autocracy and serfdom, which were not surprising in the 18th century, now appeared as barbarism. Russian Tsar's aspirations to be the gendarme of all Europe simultaneously both frightened and irritated. Russia began to be perceived as a geopolitical and civilizational threat. The control of the Black Sea Straits had paramount importance for Russia. When in 1840s Turkey closed the straits for all military fleets, it had a severe impact on Russia. Its fleet was trapped in the Black Sea. Therefore, Moscow sought to use military force to resolve the straits issue and strengthen its influence in the Balkans and the Middle East. Just as Russia now considers the entire territory of the former USSR as its sphere of influence, at that time autocracy considered all Orthodox people of Europe as its geopolitical sphere of influence. However, Western countries were not willing to allow Russia to gain access to the Mediterranean Sea and strengthen itself in its region. The immediate cause of the war was the conflict between Orthodox and Catholics in Palestine over control of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. France supported the Catholic clergy, while Russia supported Orthodox. Turkey decided the dispute in favor of the Catholics, which angered Russia. It should be noted that there was personal antipathy of Nicholas I towards Emperor Napoleon III of France, who came to power after a coup. Russian Tsar considered Napoleon illegitimate and, in a congratulatory telegram, addressed him as "dear friend" instead of protocol-appropriate "dear brother." This was a public insult, and a French leader did not forgive it. Notice how centuries pass, but nothing changes in Russian diplomacy. Insulting and belittling partners is considered as a normal practice.
Watch this.
So, the dispute over the keys to the church certainly wasn't worth shedding blood for. But Nicholas I was merely seeking a pretext. In June 1853, without declaring war, he occupied Moldavia and Wallachia. Turkey declared war on Russia after refusing to withdraw its troops. After defeat of the Turkish fleet, France and Britain joined the war against Russia. The Anglo-French fleet appeared in the Baltic Sea and attacked Kronstadt. However, the main goal of the United Command was the capture of Sevastopol, Russia's main naval base. In September 1854, the Allies landed an expeditionary corps near Eupatoria. Within a week, Russian army was defeated at the river Alma. A day before battle, Russian General Kiryakov promised the commander-in-chief Menshikov that his troops would throw the enemy heads, hence the famous expression. However, as is customary in Russia, they threw heads but ended up with corpses. Interestingly, Menshikov was so confident of an easy victory that he invited the residents of Sevastopol to come and watch the battle. English and French were astonished to see civilians having a picnic in the vicinity. After months of bloody siege, Sevastopol was left by Russians in early September 1855. The Black Sea Fleet was scuttled by Russians themselves. Emperor Nicholas did not live to see the surrender of the main fortress. He died of the flu after catching a cold during a parade. There are testimonies that he deliberately caught a cold and sought death. The government of a new emperor, Alexander II, concluded a peace treaty with Turkey and Western countries. By the way, an important point is that neither London nor Paris had any intention of occupying Crimea or advancing into Russia. They did not claim Russian territories. The blow was struck only against the Black Sea Fleet. In today's terms, this would be called a policy of containment. As a result of the Treaty of Paris, part of Bessarabia was taken from Russia. It lost the right to protect the Danubian principalities and Serbia. But the most difficult and humiliating was the prohibition on keeping a fleet in the Black Sea. St. Petersburg had to reduce diplomatic activity for 15 years. Russia, which still remembered the parade of 1814 on the Champs-Élysées, was shocked to realize that it could not successfully confront the European armies. The Crimean War exposed the hopeless lag of the Russian Empire compared to Europe, not only in the military field, but also in industry, technology, and governmental structures. A huge bureaucratic apparatus, corruption, and embezzlement had always been faithful companions under all regimes in Russia.
Watch this.
The lessons of this war are as relevant today as ever. The pursuit of expansion rather than internal development does not lead to prosperity. And the war with a neighboring state strengthens power only if it is quick and bloodless. The Russo-Japanese War amazed the whole world. The victory of a small Japan over a huge adversary seemed like something out of the realm of fantasy. In the 20th century, Russia entered with both achievements and problems. Industries were growing, albeit with a half-century delay, and significant railroad construction was underway. However, Russia remained the only major country in the world without a parliament and a free press. Autocracy in the 20th century appeared as a clear anachronism. This caused contradictions in society, which increasingly demanded change. Revolution was looming. A swift victory in a war against an adversary could boost patriotic sentiments and strengthen the autocratic regime. The famous words of the Minister of Interior, Vyacheslav Plehve, became known. To quell the revolution, we need a small, victorious war. Since then, this expression has been used when a country's government proves ineffective in domestic policy and tries to divert the attention of its people through the outbreak of such a war. It was only necessary to choose an enemy, and Japan was a perfect fit for that role. Most Russian tsars and emperors pursued policies of annexation and expansion, enlarging the borders of the empire. Peter I opened the windows to Europe. Catherine II was obsessed with the ideas of partitioning Poland and the Ottoman Empire. Alexander II was driven by the ideas of Pan-Slavism. By the reign of Nicholas II, the international situation had set limits to Russian expansion in the western and southern directions. The East remained. The Tsar embarked on the Great Asian Program. As recalled by Prime Minister Sergei Witte, Nicholas dreams of taking on the title of the Chinese Bod Han and the Japanese Mikado. Modest dreams, wouldn't you agree? In the latter half of the 19th century, following the Meiji Restoration, Japan abandoned its policy of isolation and set a course for modernization. Massive reforms were implemented, modern industries were established, the army and navy were restructured along Western lines. Japan gained strength and began contemplating expansion primarily into Korea and China. In the lightning-fast war of 1895, Japan wrested the strategically important Liaodong Peninsula from China. Russia, France, and Germany issued an ultimatum and forced Japanese people to withdraw from the peninsula. Japanese people began to dream of revenge and prepare for it. For its mediation, Russia obtained from the alien Chinese Empire the right to lease ice-free ports on the peninsula. And soon, to quell a rebellion and save the Qin dynasty, Russian troops entered Manchuria and, despite their promised intentions, showed no intention of leaving. Nicholas II received a confidential proposal from Japanese government to divide spheres of influence. Manchuria for Russia, China for Japan. But this seemed insufficient to the Russian Tsar. There was another personal reason why Nicholas disliked Japan. In 1891, the future emperor was on a round-the-world tour, and in Japan, a fanatic samurai attempted to assassinate him. The heir received 2 saber blows to the head. At the time, this incident did not cause any international tension, but Tsar always remembered the insult.
Watch this.
Further actions of St. Petersburg today would be called a hybrid war. Disguised as lumberjacks, soldiers and officers were secretly sent to Korea, where military facilities were constructed. Among the imperial entourage and military circles, there prevailed the belief that the war would be very swift, that Russia would initiate it whenever desired, and that victory would be swift and easy. Xenophobic sentiments were always present in Russian society. Newspapers at that time shaped a contemptuous views of the Japanese nation. Japan was depicted as a weak and inconsequential country far away. The emperor himself, and after him the whole society, contemptuously called the Japanese macaques and did not perceive them as a serious military force. The encounter with the real Japanese, disciplined and courageous, was a surprise. The self-deception into which Russian propaganda plunged the military dissipated, but the cost was too high. How can you not see a parallel with the war that Russia unleashed in Ukraine, in the hope of a 3-day victory march? Japan's attack on Port Arthur in February 1904 was a surprise for Russians. They were convinced that Russia would initiate the war. Initially, the battles were fought with varying success, leading to several major land battles with heavy losses on both sides. However, the more modernized and advanced Japanese army and navy began to gain the upper hand. Port Arthur fell. The Battle of Mukden became the largest land battle in history prior to the start of World War I. Russian army was defeated. The final blow in the war came in May 1905 with the naval battle of Tsushima, the heaviest defeat in the history of the Russian fleet. Russia lost 21 ships and over 5,000 men. Japanese losses amounted to only 3 ships and 120 casualties. The word Tsushima came to be used in the Russian language as a symbol of defeat and failure. The last act was the landing of Japanese army on Sakhalin. Following this, the imperial government sought peace. Defeats of the Russian fleet and army raised questions about corruption in these areas. In July 1904, Minister Pleve, the author of the famous phrase about a victorious war, was assassinated by terrorists. A wave of strikes and protests swept across the country. Bloody Sunday followed. A revolution began in Russia. The war, originally intended to prevent revolution, became its cause. Through the mediation of the United States, a peace treaty was signed in Portsmouth on September 5, 1905. Russia recognized Korea as Japan's sphere of influence, ceded the Liaodong Peninsula with its ports to Japan, surrendered half of Sakhalin and all adjoining islands. The signing of the peace treaty sparked protests in Tokyo, and Russians were also dissatisfied. For the first time in many years, Russia lost part of its territory. A future conflict between these two countries was inevitable.
Watch this.
Just as modern Russia cannot come to terms with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the USSR for decades could not come to terms with the loss of territories after the collapse of the Russian Empire. After forming an alliance with Nazi Germany, the USSR began to reclaim former lands. Following the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact and the partition of Poland, the Soviet Union annexed the Baltic states and planned to do the same with Finland. Since the beginning of the 19th century, Finland had been part of the empire as the Grand Duchy and became independent after the 1917 revolution. The Soviet government demanded a part of Finnish territory under the pretext of needing to move the border away from Leningrad. The true goal, as was the case with the Baltic states, was the Sovietization and complete control of Finland. After the failed negotiations, war began. As usual, Russians provoked the conflict. In late November 1939, they shelled their own village on the border. Then, after capturing the village of Terjoki and bringing in Finnish communist Otto Kuusinen, the USSR established the puppet Finnish Democratic Republic. By providing assistance to it, the Red Army started occupying Finland. Vyacheslav Molotov, the foreign minister and chief associate of Stalin, declared, "Tomorrow we will have dinner in Helsinki." However, reality turned out to be quite different. The Red Army's numerical strength exceeded Finland's by 1.5 times. There were 5 times more artillery pieces and 10 times more aircraft. But the USSR encountered strong and skillful resistance. The spirit of Finns was high, and it was a complete surprise to Stalin that all of the Finnish people stood up to defend their homeland. The perpetual weakness of Russians, underestimating the enemy, also played a significant role. They couldn't immediately break through the famous Mannerheim line. Only by tripling the size of their forces and incurring colossal losses did the Red Army gain an advantage. Ultimately, Finns had to agree to territorial losses, with 10% of Finland's territory transferring to the USSR. Therefore, Russian propaganda presents the war as a victory. However, the country's independence was preserved, and Stalin's puppet government was successfully forgotten. The Soviet Union suffered substantial losses. In just 105 days of war, 127,000 people were killed, and nearly 250,000 were wounded or severely frostbitten. But Russia was never concerned about the number of casualties. Wars were always waged according to Potemkin's principle: women give birth. Regardless of the political regime, Russia is capable of winning wars by throwing the corpses of its soldiers at the enemy. The Soviet Union also suffered significant political damage. First, it was expelled from the list of civilized countries and removed from the League of Nations. Second, after the failures of the Red Army, Hitler concluded that the Wehrmacht could easily deal with it.
Watch this.
Unfortunately, the timing of the program does not allow us to cover all of Russia's lost military conflicts. However, you're probably well aware of 2 recent ones. The Afghan War of 1979-89 led to the death of over 15,000 Soviet soldiers in a foreign land. The protracted war with unclear goals became one of the main reasons for the collapse of the USSR. However, in modern Russia, the Afghan War is no longer considered a defeat. The Russian dictator has repeatedly stated that the goals of Soviet Union were achieved. Russia also suffered a defeat in the First Chechen War. Refusing to accept the declaration of independence by the Chechen Republic of Ichkeria, Russia deployed its troops and, as usual, hoped for a quick and easy victory. Defense Minister Pavel Grachev promised to take the capital Grozny within 2 hours with the forces of a single airborne regiment. As a result, the war stretched for a year and a half and cost the lives of over 14,000 Russian soldiers. Civilian casualties are estimated to be over 100,000. Cities and villages were wiped off the map. Russia's actions allowed to be accused as the genocide of Chechen people. But at that time, the independence of Ichkeria was preserved, and Russia once again displayed barbaric nature before the whole world. During the Second Chechen War, Russia formally regained control over Chechnya's territory. However, in reality, for over 20 years, Russia has been paying tribute to this republic, discreetly calling it subsidies. With the help of the Kadyrov clan, which established a repressive regime in Chechnya, Russia gains loyalty from the region by paying billions of rubles. But these aspects will not be covered in the newly rewritten Russian history textbooks. Instead, they will write about the invincibility of Russian weaponry, the country's strength, and the won wars. Even the wars that Russia lost will be categorized as victories. To be continued.